Welcome to the Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Eric Olson
and Jayden Garcia.
All right, welcome back to another Westin MCAT podcast. I'm Eric, here with my boy Jayden. Today we want to talk to you guys a little bit about MCAT study schedule. You know, I think it can be hard. You know, some people have some guidance from friends or family who have done it. I know when I was getting ready to take the MCAT or, starting to think about it, I didn't have really anyone who I was close to. I had I worked in a lab and there was a guy who was a couple of years ahead of me who had just taken the MCAT and done well. So I asked him for some advice, but I think a lot of us are kind of flying by the seat of our pants and looking at stuff on Reddit and Student Doctor Network, which can be discouraging to say the least.
Stay off that website.
Yeah, there's a lot of despair and a lot of people boasting about their things, and it can be tough. Anyway, we wanted to kind of share some of our experiences and kind of what our strategies were as far as creating a study plan and kind of duration and what that looked like. So let's jump into it. Jayden, do you want to go first, and then I'll talk a little bit about my experience?
Sure. Yeah, I won't say my plan was perfect. I came into this pretty inexperienced, but we've taught so many students by now how to take this test and coached a lot of great students who scored near perfect on it. And I think we've learned from it. So I think it will be helpful to kind of talk how we did it, because we both were successful, but hopefully ways that we can augment even our own experience and things we learned from that time. So first of all, I think you start studying for this exam and your study schedule starts the beginning of college. Really, you start getting some of this material. But the formal, dedicated, in quotes, study schedule for me looked like the end of my, I think it was like beginning of sophomore year or junior year, excuse me.
Well, I was going to say beginning of sophomore year.
No, I was not then. But I want to say it was like August or so. It was on my mind, with a goal to take it sometime in May or so. And so I knew it was like on the horizon, but I didn't really do much that semester of college, I guess the fall semester of college. I had other friends who did the same review course as I did, who started that early. I didn't. I mean, I guess I started dabbling in the book I was given for the review course that we had paid for. But really, it was just to start getting the feels for what MCAT studying was like. So I'd go to the library, a couple hours a week was all during that fall semester. So really January is when I started, and I think that's first mistake, and we can talk more about that. I think I waited a little bit too long to start my big study period. And from January until May, and I took it, I think, on May 19th, was all MCAT. I'd say roughly 40-ish hours, probably more, honestly, 40 to 50 or 60 hours a week I was dedicated to doing the MCAT. I definitely felt like I needed to catch up to some of those folks who started earlier. I'm not sure I ever did, because I don't know if you can just cover as much ground as I could have if I just started earlier. And so I guess that's a message for today. But I studied until May, and in the last month, I really ramped up the amount of practice tests I took. I think I only did one before January, and I did a couple before the last month, and then in the last month, I really ramped up, which is something I'm a big fan of. And so in total, it was probably 5.5, no, sorry, my math, it's a long day, I've been in the hospital. 4 months of pretty dedicated study. And there were a couple months before that where I was just fooling around with the material. Yeah. What about you, Eric?
Well, I have two comments for you, and number one is
Critique me, man.
no. Yeah, first I'll tell you something I liked, and then something I didn't like. Number one is May 19th. You know, May 19th, brothers. Where'd you take it?
Oh, I took it in Ogden. That was a Saturday, right? If I'm thinking, I think we probably took.
It was a Saturday. Yeah, I took it in Salt Lake. Yeah, that's funny. I'm not a great. I'm a good. I'm a good studier and a good fact rememberer, but when it comes to like remembering things about my life, I'm not great at it. Like you can ask my wife and she'll be like, "Yeah, Eric knows nothing about anything," because I just don't remember things. But May 19th I remember because it was such a long time coming, right? And it was like the ultimate cap of that year.
Oh yeah.
Because I studied before it starting in probably late September was when I started.
Smart.
I'll get into that, but I also want to say, you know, you mentioned that you weren't sure if 5 months was long enough,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's fair. But I would also say that I think there's a fine line for how long you should be studying for any test, really, even the MCAT. And you know, it's funny because like you're in college and you have a final and you're like, you know, you study for like a few days or even a week or, you know, whatever the case may be. And that's like a lot of information, but the MCAT is so much information.
It is.
And a lot of it really is learning how to take the test, I believe. But a lot of it is familiarity with content as well. Like you have to have a baseline understanding of the content to be able to take the test and do well. And so I think it's a fine line to walk because I think it's also it's obviously possible to undershoot your study time. You know, if you walk into the test, you've been studying for a month, it's just, unless you're like really on top of it, and good for you if that's you, but unless you're really on top of it, that's just not enough time for the amount of information that's going to be tested on the MCAT. But I think it's also possible to overshoot. You know, the more familiar you are with the content, the better. But you know, there's something to be said for morale and getting discouraged and burned out. And there's something to be said for, oh yeah, I studied, you know, the central dogma of biology back in May of last year, and now it's April, and you know, I just took a practice test and they asked all this stuff about DNA, and now I'm like, what's going on? You know, it's a long time. And I will say, you know, I started in September. It was a long time from September to May. And it was something I thought about a lot. Like, am I going to remember this stuff from May? And so I think, you know, my strategy, and I also, you know, I used a prep course, which I think was helpful in kind of allowing me some peace of mind in thinking that I wasn't missing anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the AAMC has information available online of like, I think it's called What's on the MCAT. And it's just a list of like topics and subtopics and things.
Biology.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Theories of emotion. And then that's all it says. And you're like, okay, what theories of emotion? So I think, you know, that can obviously be helpful. But I was just nervous. I was like, you know, I don't know. What if there's some, you know, component of physiology that I missed somehow that like we didn't teach in my university? And, you know, maybe it's this big chunk of stuff that I was supposed to know that I didn't know. I think I'd done a pretty good job of taking all the courses that I needed to. I think I'd taken every course by the time I took the MCAT. I took every course that was like on the MCAT. Like I took the physicses. I took, you know, all the chemistry up to biochemistry. I took the last semester before I took the MCAT. You know, I had taken a bunch of biology and stuff. And then I took online sociology because again, I was like, I don't want to miss anything. Like, I don't want to leave anything to chance. I just want to have done it all. And that way, you know, even if it's something that I'm not very good at, I'll at least have seen it once.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so I think that brought me some peace of mind. But yeah, I started in September, and I think I was probably putting in about 5 hours a week from September through December in that first semester. And I I'll echo you a little. You touched on this, but I think really I would hope, that the studying had been significant in these sorts of courses that are like MCAT tested courses. You can definitely roll up in January and study really hard for 5 months and take the MCAT and do well. But I think, the hope is that you've been studying with some sort of eye towards, medical school or this test at least, on your way. Because I think that adds some gravity to the situation and helps you to kind of put things into context of like, these are important things. These are things that are kind of come back that I can't just learn for the final and then get rid of. You know what I mean? So I started in September. I put in about 5 hours a week. I think one thing that I think we might touch on in a little bit is I tried to kind of vary the things that I was studying. I didn't say I'm just doing biology for this 4 months and then I'm going to do everything else. But I tried to do, a little here and a little there of a few things. But again, I didn't get through a lot in those few months. It's kind of funny to hear you say that you thought it was maybe a disadvantage not to have done that, because I didn't feel like it was a huge advantage to have done. So I don't know. Take that as you will, listeners. I think you could go either way. I took the time off in December. Like I gave myself some vacation weeks. And I think that our situation was probably a little bit different from some people who will be listening, because we were in college at the time, Jayden, that we were studying. I think we both had a goal to be taking the MCAT at the end of our junior year, applying as seniors and then jumping right into medical school. And I don't really think that's the norm anymore. I felt like my classmates in medical school, probably the majority of them had taken a year off, and then some minority of them had taken multiple years off. And so I think there are probably people listening who are studying for the MCAT who are seniors, and people who are listening who are studying and are, in the workforce or, doing whatever else, or post-bac or whatever the case may be. Getting back to the study schedule, I studied, from January through May. I was in classes during that time. I had kind of left my schedule to be a little bit lighter, except for the biochemistry, which I felt was helpful actually, because I do find that the MCAT is a very biochemistry heavy exam. Yeah. And so having that, recent familiarity, I think was pretty helpful for me. But I don't think I put in quite as many hours as you did, although I had that maybe backlog of some hours from those first few months, but I was probably putting in maybe 30 to 40 hours a week. So probably just a little bit less than you. But like, if you're listening, like do the math on that. That is a lot of hours for either Jayden or myself. It's like 40 hours times 4 weeks in a month times 5 months is like 500 hours. Is that right?
Yeah.
I think. That's a lot of hours. And so I think it can be easy. I talked with a girl just the other day who was getting ready for the MCAT, and she started studying a month ago, and she's taken it in a month. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I hope that goes well. But in my experience, and, both with my own experience and, Jayden's experience and the many students that we've taught, you have to put some real time into your preparation. And part of it is familiarity with the content, and part of it is familiarity with the test and the way that it asks questions and the way that these passages come at you. Some of these passages are so off the wall. And if you come into the test and you've never seen a passage that made you freak out before, you got to have some of those under your belt, Yeah,
absolutely. There's, I think, a common mistake, and I think that's probably some of the most helpful information we can share, as I bet between the two of us, there's been at least 70 students that have been mentored over the years. At least. I'm probably grossly underestimating. I think a common mistake is not understanding why this test requires more time. And I think you just hit on a piece of this, because I've seen some of the most brilliant people do really bad on this test. It's not like they didn't have the knowledge. They were 4.0 students, but they hadn't been in that position to be so clueless in a passage and learn how to navigate that, use strategic methods on pulling out what they knew from their brain and putting it on paper. That's what gets people. And to your point, you need time. You need repetitions. Even if you know how the science works, the application piece, I get hesitant anytime I see somebody who wants to just study for a month. And usually the response is, I did well in undergrad.
Yeah.
And it's like, that's great. But some of these things, you're underestimating this test. They're not going to test you the way your chemistry professor did. They're not going to just ask you to push some arrows, right? I mean, they're taking it to a whole nother level. And so I hope we can convey what we have found to be helpful and what we have found students to make mistakes on time and time again. Because I don't know if there's, to your point, Eric, there's not one way to do this. There's not one way. I'd be very wary of people telling you this is how you have to study for the MCAT, because you're coming in with a totally different background than this person likely. Even if you went to the same undergrad, some people have strengths, some people have weaknesses in different areas. Some people had different backgrounds in their college rigor. Some people, have different time constraints to prepare for the test. Some people have different test taking ability from the get-go. That could be learned, but there are some people that innately understand this maybe quicker. And so they need a little bit more time. Others need more time from a strategy perspective. So I think we need to be honest with ourselves whenever we're preparing for a standardized test. If you did not do that well in college and you really struggle with basic science principles, you're going to need a little bit more time, probably a lot bit more time than somebody who was a 4.0 student who just breezed by every class.
Yeah.
This honesty piece is really important. What your weaknesses are. Sometimes it's hard to talk about those, but I would first meeting with students, what are you good at? What are you not? Because those pieces that you're not, that's where we should be spending most of our time, at least from a content perspective. And then people always have better things about strategy. Some people are really fast test takers, and that's great. Some are slower. And if you're slower, we need to work on timing, So I don't want to get into weeds too much, but I think this honesty piece, that's an advice I would give. Be honest with yourself. Get a lot of information, but realize that you need to adapt to where you are in your background.
Yeah.
And, at Jack Westin, just a plug, we're always here to help you with that. We offer lots of different tutoring services to help you do that. But, there are other resources that you can use as well. But it's an important aspect of preparing and setting a timeline and study pattern.
Jayden, I do just want to follow up and ask you, you mentioned that you could be a 4.0 student and, know all the content down pat, and it doesn't necessarily translate to success on the MCAT because of some of these intricacies of how they present things to you and the different sorts of passages and things. It's not a fact memorization test, right?
Right.
And so my question for you is, as we talk about, generating a study plan and trying to figure out the best way to prepare yourself over a period of time, how do you advise students? And again, as you said, I think this is really important. It's different for every person, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to give a blanket advice. But what are your thoughts on how to mix your study of the content and you're trying to master those principles with, exposing yourself to difficult passages and trying to understand the test, because they're kind of two different goals at play when you're getting ready for the MCAT. And one is understanding the content, and two is learning the test. I think they're both equally important. You can't do well with one and not the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's easy for students to get caught up in the content and learning the difficult principles and memorizing all the theories of child development and stuff like that. And it's sometimes harder to work in and make time for, test taking skills and recognition of MCAT type questions and things like that. So what thoughts do you have on kind of mixing those two goals together?
one thing I'll say right off the bat is, as we've mentioned, there's many ways to skin a cat here. I think telling you a certain way how to do it is not the right move, but recognizing principles that you can apply to not just this test, but step 1, step 2, so on and so forth are important. Eric, you mentioned that you studied in September. I started studying in January, and we had really 2 separate problems that we had to accept when we started on the journey. Yours was this problem of retention. How do you keep those who study longer have the burden of keeping things in their brain longer? And that is different than me. I still think 4.5 months is hard to keep things in your brain, but I was trying to get so much in at one time, and that was my burden. And I think recognizing that at the beginning will help you decide how to mix this idea of content with practice, which is kind of what I was teasing out. I think if you're going to be studying for 5 months or longer, which is totally reasonable to do, you need to have something probably most of the way, if not the entire way up until the last month, where you are getting repetition on things you've seen. I used Anki. I think, Eric, probably you did as well. Some people use Quizlet. I think that's got to be a mainstay in your practice or in your study patterns. If you're studying for prolonged periods, probably anybody taking the MCAT should be using one of those devices, just so that you can remind yourself of the content. And I think the other principle is, it's probably a teeter-totter. You probably shouldn't be taking hundreds of questions in a week when you first start, because you probably don't have all the content down. And while it will be useful to start seeing difficult passages, if you don't have the base foundation, you won't really know where to go at all. And so I would always tell students, in the beginning, it's probably 70%-ish, if I could give a number, of content review, really just making sure you understand these basic principles. And as you get in the last month or two, it's probably flipped, where 70% of that is more on the practice side. And maybe that other 30% comes from Anki or Quizlet, just to remind you of some of these things you've learned. And I think that teeter-totter flip is really, really important. And I've seen students just never make that transition. It's 80% to 90% content all the way through until their test date. Bad idea. Bad idea. You just won't get enough practice. And if you flip it from the beginning and all you're doing is taking practice questions, you're not going to have the content. So I think that 70-30 teeter-totter is kind of a basic rule, but I kind of defer to you as well on how you advise.
No, yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think you will lose if you take it any other way. If you only do content, as you said, then you'll never learn the test. And you don't want to just do content for 6 months and then spend a month trying to learn the test. It's just not enough time. You have to do both at the same time. And alternatively, if you do too much trying to learn the test at the beginning, then you probably not only will have a hard time learning the content, but it's just discouraging. I mean, this is discouraging when you start. I remember doing these passages, and like I would get 30% of questions right on 3 passages plus a few standalones, and then sometimes you'd get 85%, and it was like, man, this is incredible. I feel on top of the world. So I think you have to do both. I totally agree with your, I think it's kind of a gestalt of how much you're doing of each. But I do think it's important to have a mix of both. And I agree that I would start more with content and then kind of shift. And I'm thinking back to my experience, and, you say that the problem that I accepted was retention over that long period of study. And I agree with you. For me, it was. For a lot of people, at least individuals that I've helped coach and tutor that study for a long period of time, it can be procrastination. I think it's harder to procrastinate when you're having a shorter period of time because it's right on top of you. When you say, it's September. I'm not taking it till May. I have forever to take the MCAT. It's not going to be a problem. It can be easy to kind of push. I'll do 2 hours instead of 5 this week, and then the next week, I'll do. I did 4 this week. I'm going to do. I don't have time this week. I have an exam. You know what I mean? And it gets pushed down and pushed down the road. And that can cause problems not only with mastering everything content-wise, it can cause problems with your familiarity with the test. It makes it difficult to kind of shift to that 70-30 or 30-70 of more kind of practice questions as you get closer to the test. When I was getting close to the test, I'm just remembering the last couple of weeks, and my wife had gone on a trip. She went to Asia with her mom because they found some, Groupon tickets or something. I don't know. Which was good for me because it made me focus. And I stayed, my lease was up. So I stayed in my friend's apartment who was out of town. I was like in his apartment for a week, and then I stayed with a family member for a week or something. And the only things I was doing was I would wake up in the morning, I would go to the library, I would do a practice test, and then I would review the practice test. And I was trying to determine, what went wrong with the questions I missed. And it was very rarely content at that point, right? I had been studying for many months, and I had, again, really put, 40 hours a week, 30, 40 hours a week in for an extended period of time to learn this. And so it was usually like, I misread this, or I didn't understand what they were asking or something. And so I would go through and note those things down, but there wasn't a lot of going back to learn content. Mm-hmm. And so the test would take, 8 hours, and then I would review it for an hour. And then I had 5 or 6 hours, and I would go to the gym. I was fit at that time. My wife was out of town. I had nothing to do. I would take the test. I would go to the gym. And then I would watch Parks and Rec. And I had never seen Parks and Rec before. Have you seen it?
I love it.
I had never seen Parks and Rec before, and I had tried to start it, but the first season is just kind of it's not as good as the rest of it. Objectively, right. Not as good. Yeah. And so this time I was like, no, I'm just going to get through it like someone. And I think I skipped the first season. I just started with season 2. and I think I watched all of it in that 3 or 4 weeks leading up to the test. And my wife wasn't gone that whole time. I think she's gone for 11 or 12 days. But I was just focused, I was like, this is what I'm doing. I'm taking the test. I know all the content, I'm just exposing myself. I'm just learning the test. Mm-hmm. And I was laser focused, and I had that time, and I had enough time to finish Parks and Rec. Clearly I was making time for other things because I had put in all that work up to that point. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting to me, I guess, the point of the story that you would say my issue was retention, when with so many students that study for a longer period, it's procrastination. It's getting to the end, the last 2-3 weeks, and it's I still haven't studied biochemistry at all. And, I still am getting, 123s on my practice cars. And it's okay, you should have done biochem, and you should have been doing car practice this entire time. You know what I mean? You should have been reading some passages. You should have been reading things and getting ready for that. And so I think it's easy to get snuck up on. And I think for that reason, it's really important to have a schedule of time, a time schedule for yourself. I think a lot of people probably use Excel or Google Sheets or something like that. This is what I want to do this week. Here's how much time I'm going to put in. Here's what I'm going to study. I'm going to do these practice question sets. I'm meeting with my coach or my mentor at this time. We're going to talk about this and that, and sticking to those things. Because if you don't, you start to make exceptions. It's a snowball, and other things will come up, and, your car will break down, and then your rent will be due, and you don't have any money. And these things are going to spiral out of control. So you have to make time and be willing to sacrifice and put in that time so that you can stay on top of it. And like I said, I wasn't a perfect student by any means, but by the end I was not sweating, I was prepared because I had put in that time. And I think part of it is just that, that mental dedication of saying, I'm taking the MCAT this year. It's the most important thing I'm going to do this year. And so I'm going to be I'm going to put in the time. If I don't start studying till January, I'm going to put in 40 hours a week and really make that your priority. And then it's harder to get behind when that's your number one goal.
I second everything you said. It was so hard to see some students that ultimately not do well, who, we had coached on a similar timeline of September to May, a very popular timeline, and just seeing how far behind they were getting compared to some of our other students who stayed accountable and would stay on pace, right? I mean, we talk about this marathon analogy, and in so many ways it's true. You don't see marathon runners running 25-minute miles for the first 10 and then 4-minute miles or 2-minute mile or 3-minute miles or whatever it is, the last 10 or 12. They're frequently checking their watch to make sure they are on pace, not going too fast where they burn out, but not getting behind. And so many students are so quick to push the MCAT to the back burner in those initial 4 or 5 months for those reasons you brought up. And I had to try and remind them, you could take an A- in this class and dedicate that extra time that would have gotten you an A, and your GPA will hardly budge at this point. Yep. Hardly budge. You have tons of classes under your belt. And you can score a 4 or 5 points higher than you were if you stay on this pace and potentially get into the medical school you always wanted to, or get a scholarship. I mean, yeah. But they resist that. That was like some of the most, and it's not like they openly resisted it, but I think deep down, students have a really hard time putting some of those other things aside for the MCAT. And it's really kind of the last checkbox for most people. Like, your research is hardly going to change in the next couple of months. Your grades are hardly going to change in the next couple of months. But these are the reasons that people will tell you they're procrastinating, and there's like rationalization behind it. And if you can get through that, all those listening, and you stay on pace, you're going to be like Eric in the sense of not worrying about procrastination. Your focus is just retaining, and you don't feel behind. And you just don't want to get caught into that spiral. It's really rough to get out of, because then you delay tests. It's messy. It's messy.
It's interesting. And you're so right. I think we've had this conversation a million times with all these different students of like, what can we cut out? But it's funny, when you talk about, when people ask you, you tell someone who's, who knows about the application process and everything, and you say, oh yeah, I'm applying. They say, oh, what's your GPA and MCAT score? Because those are like the two things that are kind of going to get you in the door. Or they're kind of the threshold at a lot of places. And like you said, I mean, one class, unless you absolutely fail, it's not going to change your GPA. And even then, I mean, depending on where you're at and how many credits you've taken and how many credits the class is. Whereas the MCAT, that's like, it's a one-off score. Your one class, your one, chemistry class is going to go into this bucket of, this is my GPA. No one asks you, oh, what was your organic chemistry 2 grade and your MCAT score, And so it's interesting. And then I think about, what are the other things that go into the medical school application? It's like, I've had students who said, oh, I have this volunteering thing, and, it's this long-term thing. I've been doing it for 3 years, and I really don't, I think it shows longevity, and I don't want to give it up because it shows my consistency. And I'm like, okay, do you think they would rather have someone with, a 5.10 MCAT who works in this volunteering thing for 3.5 years, or someone with a 5.17 MCAT who did it for 3 years? You know what I mean? Like, it's a big,
every time.
It's a huge difference. And so and I think the difference, Jayden, is, and maybe this is unfair, but I think it's scary to put your eggs in the MCAT basket, because you can spend so much time study. Like for me to keep doing the volunteering thing that I'm doing, it's like a couple hours a week, right? And then I get to put that on my CV of like, yeah, I'm still doing this volunteering thing. It's been all this time. I'm still doing it. Whereas you can spend 40 hours a week studying for the MCAT and, hopefully it goes well. But, worst case scenario, you get sick on test day and you bomb it. You know what I mean? And that's like so not even in the like real realm of possibility. But people get worried. What if I spend all this time on the MCAT and I still just don't get it?
Right.
And so I think it's easier to say, I'm going to put in these few hours in my class, make sure I get an A. I'm going to put in these few hours doing my other volunteering thing and make sure that stays on my CV. And, hopefully the MCAT goes well.
Right.
Whereas if you give up these other things, what I or you would tell someone is you're giving up those things and allowing yourself more time, and the consistency of that time will lead you to a better MCAT score. There's like not really another way around it. If you are consistent, if you study hard, if you practice, you'll do well. But I think it's the unknown of that test and just putting all the effort in that scares people. And I was just like,
oh no, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to reiterate, if you study hard and you put in the time and you practice, that you will do well. It sometimes requires sacrifice of some of these other things, but again, it has to be your number one priority.
And I want to second that, because out of these 70, 80, 90 students that we have coached personally, not talking to a group of students, these were individuals that we took from start to finish with this test. There are few that put in the work, did not procrastinate, even if they didn't come in with the greatest backgrounds, that we couldn't get them to a really good spot. It's just rare. And I hope, those listening can hear what you're saying. It is scary to put it all in one basket, but at the end of the day, this test largely determines work ethic. Yes, there will always be people who don't have to do much to do well, but that's not the vast majority of people. And those who do put the eggs in the basket tend to do much better. And I think the other thing I would say is somebody who's sat on an admissions committee at the best university or medical school, at least ranked wise in the country, there is no getting past, there's no research or volunteer experience that is going to make a bad MCAT score just go away in our minds. You just can't. I've looked at so many good applications, and I know that's the misunderstanding that's out there. It kind of gets talked about, by certain guidance counselors or whatever, that a bad MCAT score can be overcome, and to an extent, right? A 512 with really, really great volunteer standout research, yes, you will probably get into medical school. But a lot of these students that I see procrastinate the way we're talking about and make these mistakes are not even in the range of 512. We're talking, we've had multiple conversations about students and how we were going to approach coaching them. And these kind of students are typically much lower than that. And I really can tell you, as an admissions person in the past, it doesn't matter what else you bring to the table. It will certainly close almost every door. So you really do have to kind of put the eggs in the basket. And, there's a lot of people out there willing to help you with that.
Yeah. Us included.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think, kind of to wrap up, we've been talking a lot about effort, and I think effort is paramount. It's hard to get away from effort and being willing to, sacrifice some of these other things, make this a priority. Putting your eggs in the MCAT basket. And, for me as well, there were costs associated with it as far as, being able to do other things with my friends. There were financial costs associated with studying. You have to buy materials and things like that. And again, it's an investment in yourself and in your ability to do well on this test. You have to dedicate the time over a period of time. You have to be consistent. Like we talked about, I think for as far as we're concerned, it's helpful to start with a lot of content, more content than strategy, and practice with the test, and then kind of shift that paradigm to do more test prep practice, taking practice tests, things like that as you get closer to your test date. The other thing I would say, just briefly as we kind of wrap up here, is that a lot of times we get asked questions about how to do or how to approach content, and like what to study first and what to study last. As we talked about early in this episode, I don't think there's a right answer as far as, should you start with the sciences? Should you start with, the psychology section or anything like that? I do think it's important to mix and to not, go through all of chemistry before you do all of physics and then do CAR for 2 months straight. You do a little bit of different things, spend a week on one topic, spend another week on something else. It's something about that spaced repetition. And we talked about using the Anki or the Quizlet and flashcards and things like that. But you don't want to kind of pigeonhole yourself into one subject matter. And then you run the risk of, forgetting those things and not having the repeated exposure that can help to really drill those things down in your brain. Again, these are things that, we can help with specific cases, and the consultants and tutors at Jack Westin as well are happy to help in developing these individualized study plans. There's just kind of some general principles of how to prepare, but every case is unique. And there's a lot of ways to do it. A lot of ways to do it right. And we're happy to help kind of generate those plans and help you with your goals. Jayden, do you have anything else to add before we close?
Just, I know some people could listen to this podcast episode and still be frustrated that we brought out a lot of principles that we hope you hold on to. But I guess a couple of other, generalizable things. Again, we want to give the caveat that every person's different, and following this to a recipe or to a T, if you will, may not be the right move for you. But I think in our experience with multiple students, some like last minute things we can say is probably most students do well at about 5 to 7 months of study. If we had to give you a ballpark, Eric, let me know if any of these things you disagree with here. We'd say we gave you kind of the rule of thumb, 70-30 in the beginning and kind of flopping. I think we'd probably tell you as well, you should build in about 10-ish practice tests if you really want to set yourself up. Again, there are some students that may only need to take 3, but that's not the vast majority. I would say to really be prepared, you should build in at least 10 plus practice exams for specifics. We talked about the 500-hour rule. That's probably fairly ballpark-ish for most students. If you're doing 100 hours, that's just not going to cut it. So I would keep that 500 from 2 people who did fairly similar hours in your back pocket as you build this schedule. I would say don't be afraid to push the test if you're not ready. Again, as somebody who's been on the admissions team, if you get a 500 one time and then the next time you get a 510, most people are not going to be impressed. You really have to make a big difference to see anybody bat an eye in between, 2 tests. So really try and make the one count, but don't feel discouraged if you've already taken it. Just really try and make a maximum difference. And then I think the last thing would be work backwards from your goal. If you plan to take it in May 19th, start from there, build your schedule back so you know how long you need to study for this, and then be accountable. So I hope those are kind of some specific things that we could wrap up with if you were looking for very precise numbers. But again, it's just a ballpark. And Eric, I don't know if you had anything else to add to those.
May 19th. May 19th is such a great
day. It's a great day to take it on May 19th.
If I was going to take it again, that would be the day. So yeah, it's good stuff. And yeah, best of luck to you all in generating your study plans and getting ready for the test, and happy studying.
Take care, everyone.